Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. My best friend had an uncle, his Uncle Tony, who had a very popular Italian restaurant in Hartford, Connecticut. And it was quite a nice place. It was one of the most popular restaurants in Hartford, Connecticut, because the food was terrific, the wine was good, the atmosphere was great. And on Friday and Saturday nights on the weekend, Tony would have a real imported from Italy band. These guys were immigrants, but they were Italian immigrants, and they were very, very good musicians. And he would have good music, good vocalists, and it always did very, very well. The restaurant did well without that anyway during the week because everything else about it was very, very good. It also didn't hurt that Tony was the reputed mob boss of the Connecticut mafia. And I guess in a perverted way, I don't know why people act this way in America, but that's the American equivalent of a Michelin star. You know, people are interested when they hear a mobster maybe owns a restaurant or has an interest or goes or frequents a restaurant. It seems to attract all sorts of other people. The people are really funny that way. Doesn't make the food any better, but they think it does. In any event, Tony was an interesting guy. He was about 6 foot tall, about 220, very trim. He was athletic. In fact, in high school, he was the best running back in Connecticut high school football for years while he played varsity ball in Hartford. He was a handsome guy, very good-looking guy, and he had light hair and bright eyes and a big smile on his face. And he had a terrific sense of humor. And he was actually very funny, which didn't matter because in most cases everybody was laughing at his jokes, whether they were funny or not. It didn't matter too much. And that's judges have the same thing. They tell you in judge school, you know, when you tell a joke in court and everybody laughs, don't think it's because you're funny. You're not funny. You're just doing it out of respect, you know. So, but Tony actually was a very, he had a great sense of humor, a lot of fun, very sharp. Well, a friend of mine managed an up-and-coming young fighter. He's a real wonderful prospect, and he was fighting a main event at the Hartford Civic Arena. And I decided with my friend, let's go up to Hartford and see the fight. My buddy is managing this fighter. We'll go there, and we'll watch the fight. And afterwards, we'll spend the night overnight in Hartford rather than drive back after the boxing program. And we can go to Uncle Tony's restaurant and have a nice meal and say hello to everybody and your cousins and family and stuff like that. And we'll make a day of it, and we'll come back the next day. So that was the idea. And we went to the fight, and Hartford Civic Arena was packed. It was a good program. It was a good main event fought by my friend's fighter, and he won. It was all favorable, and in the course of the evening, my friend, the boxing manager, introduced us to the promoter of the whole night's boxing card, who was a middle-aged white guy, balding. He was probably in his late 50s, and he had a paunch belly, you know, a little bit of a pot belly. But he was a very jovial guy, a very decent guy, and he looked, you know, like a prosperous fight promoter anyway, or a businessman. And a nice man. We congratulated him he ran a nice card. It was very nice. We enjoyed ourselves. It was very good show, good competitive matches, et cetera, et cetera. And it looks like you succeeded very well. And he thanked us. And that was the end of it. After the fight, my friend and I took up the second part of the trip, and we headed for Uncle Tony's restaurant about 10 o'clock at night now, about 10 or 11 o'clock. And we dropped into the restaurant, and the place was packed. It was Friday night, and it was packed, and it was great. The whole atmosphere was jovial. It was a multi-generational crowd. We had grandparents, parents, kids, grandchildren, and everything in between. The whole thing was pretty much, and the band, the Italian band was playing and singing and everything else, and people were just, it was like, I guess it was analogous to a happy Italian wedding, and that was the atmosphere in the whole place. And everything was going very, very, very well. And we were enjoying it, and of course Uncle Tony gave us a nice warm welcome, and we started to sit down to eat. And about a half hour after we arrived, all of a sudden the place got a little bit quiet, recognizably quiet, and heads started turning, and I looked at around and what's going on, and sure enough, it's the promoter, the boxing promoter. He walks in with two young, beautiful suggestively dressed black women on his arm. And these two young women were probably 30. They were in their 20s. He was in his mid-50s. And the whole place kind of startled. They didn't expect to see that. And they were looking around, and Tony was always he was watching over the whole place all the time. He always did on the weekends. He was there all the time, and they were looking, I guess, for Tony's reaction. What's is this okay? Is it not okay? What's going on here? Tony walks right over to the guy, and the guy said, "Tony, how are you?" And Tony knows him. He's friendly with this guy apparently, and he said, and apparently this guy figured out the situation immediately, and he knew, the kind of reaction he was going to get in walking in with these women who were half his age and visibly different from what he was. And he said, for everybody to hear, Tony, he said, I want you to meet my friends here, Tamika and Jonelle. These two young ladies are sports writers, he said, and they covered this main event tonight, and they're writing nice articles in the papers, and I wanted to take them out for dinner in gratitude for them showing up and writing favorable articles about the promotion, And Tony said, really? He said, well, I'm glad to meet you, ladies, and he shook their hand. He said, why don't you all come with me? And he took them to the bar, and he bought everybody a drink, and everybody immediately, resumed the festivities as normal. It was totally diffused. There was nothing wrong. There was no problem. Tony was very smart, and the guy was very smart, and they had no problem with the whole incident. It didn't amount to anything, and it shouldn't. Tony was a decent guy. He wasn't a prejudiced guy that I know in any event, but he was a good host, and he knew what to do. So there was no problem. We had a good night. We went home. Now we're talking. Fast forward about 5 years later. It turns out, and now this is in the, I would say this in the early 80s. And Tony, in the interim, had been convicted in federal court of racketeering and a couple of relatively minor charges. When I say minor, I mean maybe there was loan sharking, maybe there was gambling, I don't know what else, particularly, I forget. But it wasn't killing anybody or anything, or bank robbery or anything of that sort, nothing violent or anything like that. But he was sentenced to 7 years in Danbury Federal Prison in Connecticut. And that was a rather stiff sentence, but he knew that, and he had been paroled. After 4 years on good conduct and everything else, he was paroled. And he had been released, but he still owed 3 years on his sentence. Now, parole is a legislative grace. Nobody has a right to parole. The legislature creates it for different reasons. They want to get the people out of prison so that they don't have to support them. And they want to give people a chance to straighten themselves out after they've demonstrated good behavior. And Tony had a 7-year sentence, and he got out after 4. And he knew his sentence was stiff, but his file was marked OC. And the federal prosecutors will do that. They'll mark a file OC. They stamp it OC, which means organized crime. And what they do what does that mean? Well, in the federal system, when a file is an OC marking, that means they're going to lean hard on them and look for maximum sentences. Well, there's a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is it certainly isn't deterrence. They're not stopping anybody who's an organized criminal from being an organized criminal. It's too lucrative. But since the days of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI is a publicity machine, and they publicize themselves, and they want everybody to know they're doing a good job. And getting stiff sentences against high-profile criminals, organized criminals, is a good way of showing the public that they're doing a very, very good job, and they're a formidable force. Also, it does help in some cases when some criminals are faced with stiff federal sentences. That encourages them to become state's evidence, and they turn and become informants and confidential informants, or even witnesses against the people, their former colleagues. So it works in that way. In any event, Tony was released, and 3 or 4 months later, he was rearrested because supposedly he violated the conditions of his parole. Well, what were the conditions? One condition was no criminal activity. And the other condition was no contact with any known criminals. Tony, he knew he was high profile in Connecticut, very high profile, and he knew that he was going to be under constant surveillance by the FBI and federal agents because there was nothing they would like better than to put him back in jail for the rest of his 3-year term, just to show that they're doing their jobs and, for all the reasons I said before. Well, that being said, Tony, being fully aware of what was going on, was very, very careful about his behavior. And he went out of his way to avoid any criminal activity and any contact with criminals. But there came a time when he was arrested. And now he was in federal prison, and he couldn't talk to anybody. Really, he could make a phone call maybe, but he spoke to his nephew, who was my friend, and said, "Listen, talk to Rudy about this. I know he does this kind of work, and ask him if he would represent me. I'm not happy with my lawyer because I got 7 years." Well, rightfully or wrongfully, he wasn't too happy with the lawyer because it was a stiff sentence. But that's more because not the lawyer did a good job, but because the feds are very efficient about prosecuting organized criminals, and they get stiff sentences from the judges. Also, they don't take cases and they don't prosecute cases unless they have pretty much of an airtight case on documentary evidence against the defendants, because it's not street crime. They don't have to go and get this guy off the street who's a threat to society in the short run, an immediate threat. So they can pick and choose their cases, and if they can get somebody indicted, it's usually because they've got the goods already and they know it. So Tony, in any event, wasn't happy with his prior lawyer, and he wanted a new lawyer, and he spoke to Gino, my friend, and to talk to me. And I said, of course, that's what I do for a living. I don't mind. And contrary to public opinion, your job as a defense lawyer is not to get the guy off. It's to make sure that the government, in prosecuting the person, follows the law and obeys the law, because as enforcers of the law, they should be held to obeying the law, first and foremost, just like a parent who makes rules for their kids. You can't ask your kids to follow rules if you're not following the rules yourself. All right, so much for the speech. Now, I'm retained, and this is not rocket science. It's a parole violation case, and I knew all I had to do was go up and talk to Tony before the actual hearing, and maybe 15, 20 minutes, and he would tell me what's going on. And then I could read the parole violation report of the FBI agents. And between the two of them, I would know exactly everything I had to do in the hearing and how to posture the representation for Tony. So the big hearing day arrives, and I go up to Connecticut. And before the hearing, I'm up there in the federal building, and Tony's in custody. He's in cuffs and everything else. And I have a private conference with him in about 20 minutes. And he told me the story. I said, "What's going on?" He says, "Well, Rudy," he said, "I've been very careful because I know they're watching me." He says, and one false move, they're going to put me back in jail or try to do this, what they're doing now, which is violate me on parole violation. He says, and I was very, very careful about everything. I didn't do anything wrong. He says, but there was one incident which I think they grabbed onto. He says, and what happened was very simple. He says, with my brother Dominic, who was in, by the way, Dominic was a legitimate businessman. He was in the cemetery gravestone business, memorials, and he had a nice business going. He said, Dominic and I went for lunch. We went to this very, very popular seafood restaurant that's known all over New England as an outstanding seafood restaurant, and we had time to kill and everything. And Dominic says, "Come on, let's go and cheer you up." He says, now I had been out on parole for about 3 or 4 months, and I went with Dominic to this restaurant. We had lunch. It was terrific lunch. The place is crowded, and we're on our way out, and he says, Dom is paying the cashier. Now there's people coming in, there's people going out. It's like a traffic jam. There's a crowd coming and going. He says it's pretty crowded right at the beginning of the restaurant. He says, and this guy comes in, and I know the guy. He comes walking in right past me, sticks out his hand to shake my hand. And reflexively, he says, I stuck out my hand and I shook his hand. And he says, I don't even think we said hello. He says, I know who he was. I don't think we said hello. He says, I just shook hands, nodded. And I said, maybe in the space of 3, maybe 5 seconds, it was over. He said, but I was being followed. And the agents took a picture of me shaking this guy's hand. He says, that's the only thing it could be. He says, I never had contact with anybody, and I know who this guy was. And he told me who the guy was. And he was a high-profile guy. So I said, okay, we're going to have a hearing. I'm going to go in and read the report. And I read the report when I went back into the hearing room. And sure enough, it was about that incident. And okay, now I know what was going on. And in the hearing room, I was joined by one guy who was wearing the FBI uniform of a dark suit, starched white shirt, and a conservative tie. I knew he was it turns out he was the FBI chief of the Connecticut bureau. He was the boss up there, and he was there because Tony was high profile and he was going to do this himself. And the other guy in the room was very informal. He says he had shaggy red hair and a shaggy mustache, and his collar was open, his tie was down, and he had no jacket on, and his sleeves were rolled up. And he said to me, and he's sitting there because it was a hot day, and he's sitting behind his desk in what turns out to be a deep, slow southern drawl, and he goes, "You're representing the defendant here?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, counselor, have a seat." He says, "I'm going to turn on we're going to start this proceeding." He says, I'm going to turn on the tape recorder because we have to record this and make a record. I don't have a stenographer." He said, "But I do have the tape recorder." I said, "No, I understand. That's regular procedure. I have no objection to that. I welcome that. That's not a problem. This way we can have a good record of all of this." Yeah. And the marshals brought in Tony now for the hearing. So the FBI agent, he's first, and he presents the story. And it's pretty much what Tony said. And he says his guy has 3 years parole left, and he violated the conditions, and he had contact with a member of organized crime. Here's a photograph of him shaking hands, and that little old man he's shaking hands with, that's Raymond Patriarca from Providence, Rhode Island, and we know Mr. Patriarca is the head of the New England Mafia. And here he is having contact with him, and that's a direct violation of his parole conditions, and therefore we want him back to serve the rest of his sentence, the rest of the 3 years. So then Tony testified, and he said what he told me in the preliminary conference. I was in the restaurant. I was on my way out, and it was crowded, and this man comes up. I know the guy, and he stuck his hand out, and I reflexively, I didn't even have time to be ill-mannered or think of not shaking his hand. I just put my hand down and shook his hand. He said, like I would do for anybody. I didn't think of the consequences or anything like that. He says, it all happened in an instant. It was a reflex and nothing more. He said, I didn't even talk to the guy. And that was it. And then I spoke. It was my turn. And I told the hearing officer, I said, look, I concentrated on the lack of substance. There's nothing here but a reflexive handshake. I said, that's it. There's nothing else, nothing more. And I believe there's no violation of parole conditions here. And that was the end of it. Is there anything more to say? No. Okay. He says, hearing is over. My decision is reserved. You'll get the decision within 2 or 3 days. I said, that's fine. Federal marshals come and escort Tony out of the room back to Danbury Prison. I'm packing up my brief. I got my notes and my yellow pad and all this other stuff. I'm packing up, and I'm upset. I'm not happy with what just happened. And spontaneously, as I'm packing up, there's only the 3 of us in the room, the agent, myself, and the hearing officer. And I couldn't help myself. And spontaneously, I said, I want to say something, and I want you gentlemen to hear it. I said, my client is out of the room now, and this is off the record. I said, I'm just going to ask both of you. I said, on that kind of evidence, on a reflexive handshake, how would you feel if somebody you convicted or somebody you arrested or somebody you violated on parole stuck his hand out and you reflexively shook that person's hand? Whether you wanted to or not, you did it as a matter of reflex. And then people were going to come and take away your job or maybe your liberty and put you in jail for reflexively shaking a guy's hand. How would you feel? Now, I know what my client is, and you both know what my client is. And he's not an Eagle Scout, but that's way beside the point. This is not right. And that's how I feel about it. And I looked at the agent right in the eye, and he diverted his gaze, he looked down, he turned his face away because he couldn't look me in the eye because he knew what I was saying had a lot of truth to it. But the hearing officer, he had a different reaction. He looked at me, and he said in his southern drawl, he says, "You all a damn pretty good lawyer, aren't you?" And I said, well, I don't know, but we'll soon find out, won't we? And I packed up and I walked out. A couple of days later, we got the decision. The hearing officer found that Tony violated his parole, but instead of giving him 3 years, gave him 3 months in Danbury, which Tony was pretty happy. That was a relative good victory because he saved 33 months in jail, and he knew, that he was going to get violated, and he was looking at 3 years, and a good possibility he was going to get the 3 years. So relatively speaking, he was happy. I wasn't happy. I didn't think he deserved anything. The hearing officer obviously thought he deserved 3 months. And of course, the chief of the FBI in Connecticut thought he deserved 3 years. And I don't know what you think he would deserve, but that's up to you. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.